Rogier Creemers, postdoctoraal wetenschapper recht en bestuur in China, werkzaam voor zowel het Van Vollenhoven Instituut als het Leiden Instituut voor Gebiedsstudies. Heeft een masterdiploma in Chinese Studies en internationale betrekkingen en een doctoraat in de rechten. Rogier is sinds 2011 werkzaam als postdoctoraal onderzoeker aan de Universiteit van Oxford. Zijn belangrijkste academische focus is Chinees internet- en mediarecht. Klopt alles wat ik zeg? Beste mensen, applaus voor Rogier Creemers. Hij heeft geen slides trouwens.
Good evening. I'll do my chat in English as well. Thank you for being here in such large numbers. It's the first time that I do this. Nevertheless, I hope you will find it interesting. We've just had a very interesting presentation from Ed Sander that talked a lot about the commercial business retail side of the technology. And what I'd like to do tonight is supplement it a little bit with some political analysis. And specifically, I would like to talk about a subject that has received quite some attention over the past couple of years, dare I say, and that is the Chinese social credit system. For those of you who have trouble sleeping, I have written an entire 15,000-word paper on this, which you can download free of charge on a website called SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, which is a website that allows researchers like me to share their work unpaywalled with the public. You can download it there, and within 5 minutes you will have dozed off, I promise. But the reason that I wanted to write that particular paper is that I was actually slightly frustrated with the level of reporting about the social credit system, which I believe is a very important symbolic issue, not just in terms of where China is going in its politics, in its governance, but also how we see China and how we adapt to a new global reality in which China is not just some country far, far away, but actually a major player having an influence on our daily lives. Now, the standard story that you might read about the social credit system goes a little bit like this. The Chinese government has started a program where every citizen will be given a 3-digit score. That 3-digit score will be based on everything they do. The car they drive, the products they purchase, crossing the traffic on a red light, and so on and so forth. Crossing the street on a red light, and so on and so forth. And on the basis of that 3-figure score, your entire life will be decided. It will be decided what job you can have, what university you can go to, what school you can send your children to, whether you can get a mortgage, which job you can have, and so on and so forth. That story is, at least at the moment, not true. I'm very sorry to say. Because there isn't actually one such thing as the social credit system. What I've come to understand is that the term social credit system actually covers an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem of mechanisms, mostly deployed by government, some deployed by private businesses, in fact, the private businesses that Ed mentioned in his paper just now. And they share some of their basic characteristics, but they're also wildly different in the things that they do. In fact, it might surprise you that early on, they weren't actually that connected with technology, right? We see this, we see the social credit system very often as something very big brotherish, right? In People's Republic of China, television watches you, sort of thing. But in fact, it started way before this wave of high technology adoption started in China. And in fact, the idea of social credit starts in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And here it might be useful to know that when you use the word credit in China, it actually has multiple meanings. It has the meaning of financial credit, as in a credit card. It also has the meaning of trustworthiness, sincerity, honesty. So whenever one hears social credit system, one should also try and hear at the back of your mind that this could also be about the social sincerity system, a social honor system. And it really starts in the early 2000s with the realization that when you move, as China then did, from a planned economy to a market economy, inevitably there's going to be some things that are going to go wrong. And in China, indeed, and as we unfortunately have ample examples of, many, many things have gone wrong. Why? People cheat, right? You're in a very rapidly developing economy where people very often don't quite know, given the political struggles of the past, what the future is going to bring, and they try and hedge their bets. They try and exploit political connections for private gain. They go for short-term profits because they can. And you end up with a melamine milk scandal. You end up with a gutter oil scandal. You end up with all kinds of pollution scandals, counterfeit products, financial swindles, the whole rigmarole. And because China has just been moving towards a market economy, it doesn't yet have the institutions, well-functioning courts, well-functioning government departments that can actually deal with these issues. As I very often have to remind my European audiences, when we talk about China and we compare, let us please not forget that we have had the inestimable luxury of living in a highly developed country for decades. A lot of things that we can take for granted, right, are a bit like the sewer system. As long as it works fine, we don't even know that it's there. When it doesn't work fine, that's when we notice. But the Dutch economy works well, and we do not have these problems that I just mentioned, not because we never had them, but because we found ways to deal with them 20, 50, 100 years ago. China is still at that stage. And so it was felt that some mechanism was necessary to try and make people more honest in the way that they behaved in the marketplace, to generate more trust in the marketplace. That was one. The other was a financial issue, and one that became gradually more important as the 2000s went on. You may have heard that one of the bigger problems that China faces in its economic development trajectory is the need for it to change its model of development. From a model of development that relies on making a lot of stuff, putting it in a container, shipping it to the US or Europe and selling it, and that model has run out of growth potential to a considerable degree, to a model whereby internal consumption would generate more economic growth for China. What do you need for internal consumption? Spending power. And what do you very often need for spending power? Credit. People need to be able to have credit cards. If you want to start a small business, you need easy access to banks. However, the Chinese banking sector at that moment, and that still remains true to a considerable degree, this is one reason why we have the large online payment sector that Ed was talking about, actually didn't serve individuals very well. It was aimed largely towards a development function, towards financing large businesses, very often state-owned enterprises, and the infrastructure and investment projects that the government found necessary for China's development agenda. What did that mean? Actually, not a lot of Chinese people had a bank account, as Ed just showed in the wonderful pictures he had. Until very, very recently, the majority of transactions in China happened in cash, including very large cash transactions. And these transactions would then be very large because for the reasons of fighting corruption, the largest Chinese banknote in existence is 100 yuan, which is now 12, 13 euros. Can you imagine buying a car with 10 euro notes? This is what people did. And so what we've seen over the last couple of years is that the social credit system has built up around the two needs of these issues. On the one hand, building trust in the marketplace. On the other hand, building up a consumer-oriented financial services industry that can actually help people spend money and grow the economy. Unsurprisingly, the government has been a little bit more interested in the former, and that's where most efforts have been made. In 2007, an interministerial joint conference was established at the central level to deal with this, but they didn't do a lot of work that captured public attention that was very impactful. At the same time, you see that this is a terminology that senior leaders had used a couple of times. Jiang Zemin first in 2002, then Hu Jintao. So you saw some local governments experimenting with ideas of social credit, some of them very successfully, like the government of Hangzhou. And the Hangzhou model of social credit in very many ways has become the national model for social credit. And then in 2014, we get a major breakthrough. Because in the meantime, a number of things have happened. One, Xi Jinping has come to power. And Xi Jinping was someone who isn't necessarily disinterested in economic growth, but Xi Jinping is much more interested in political and social issues. And what Xi Jinping understood very well is that apart from having the very high priority anti-corruption campaign, for which he's become very well known, you also need some kind of social control mechanism that works on a daily basis to create stronger incentives for people to abide by the law. And so the idea of using a credit mechanism, not just for behavior in the marketplace, but for the behavior of individuals more broadly, gained a lot more traction. And this is the point where we also see that more ministries, not traditionally associated with the market economy, get added to that interministerial joint conference. Second has been technological development. This is the point where technology, particularly data technology, and the social credit system start coming together, where the social credit system becomes a solution to yet another problem. And that problem is the fragmentation of China. China, as you may know, is huge, and there are a lot of people in it. To put things in perspective, the westernmost city of China, Kashgar, is closer to Berlin than it is to Beijing. And one of the big problems that the Chinese government has always had is the problem of the mountains being high, the emperor is far away. 山高皇帝远 in Chinese. This is a problem that hasn't been solved under the communist government. The country is divided into provinces, the province is divided into districts, the districts have cities and villages, and in all of these administrative units, there is a party official in charge who, in very many cases, can help his own career by not being completely honest, by not sending correct information upwards, for instance. Right? At some point, Li Keqiang, now China's premier, indicated that he never looked at regional GDP statistics because he knew that they were completely unreliable. But so that means that there was a huge problem, and still is a huge problem, with government oversight, over government, right? It is very difficult for the center to know what happens in the localities. And so the idea with the social credit system was that this would be a way also to break down those regional barriers and deal with the fact that, one, it was incredibly difficult for the center to know what happened at the local levels, but two, it was incredibly easy if you had done something wrong, for instance, in one province, you just scuttled off to the next province and started again. And it would be incredibly difficult to track you, right? So you sell some counterfeit goods or some poisonous food in one province, even if you get convicted for it, if you manage to escape, it would be relatively easy never to be caught again, or at least not for some time. And that's another problem that the social credit system is trying to solve by creating information sharing mechanisms for the law to be able to be applied on a nationwide level. So what you're already seeing is that as time goes on, the social credit system starts from a very narrow idea, and it just gets, these bits and bolts sort of keep being bolted on, right? It starts in the marketplace, then suddenly it's also about other forms of behavior, things like benefit fraud. It becomes about government oversight. In fact, the first, for the people who think that this is only about a dictatorial government tightening the screws on its citizens, the first section of the 2014 planning document, that is the basis of the social credit system, deals with government oversight. Oversight over government officials at the lower level, and there's another section that deals with oversights over the courts. Now, there is a lot of planning that goes on, and when you read documents such as the 2014 social credit documents, one wonders, how is this going to happen in reality? And frankly, the answer is, there are very many things that we do not know yet. Simply because this is actually a hugely complex issue. And the reason for that is that it's not just about trying to build mechanisms that connect consequences to people's affairs. You also need quite substantial data management systems to be able to capture that data and identify it in the first place. And so this is what we've seen happening a lot of over the last couple of years. The creation of a new identity card scheme with a new unique identifier for every single individual, a little bit like the Dutch BSN, the civil service number. But also the creation of a similar set of unique identifiers for companies, because the social credit system doesn't just cover individuals, it also covers businesses. And so businesses have been given their own BSN as well. And from a Chinese perspective, this is radical. This hadn't happened before. Until a couple of years ago, if you ran a basic little supermarket, like the one that Ed showed in Beijing, you had to have at least 4 or 5 different licenses from 4 or 5 different government departments, each of which had their own cataloging and filing system, and they would be different at the local and the national levels. So but particularly now, with business very often moving online, therefore becoming cross-border in the Chinese sense, right, from Beijing to Guangzhou and everything in the middle, it is necessary really to have a nationwide system with these unique identifiers. So that's the first big part of the social credit system that we've seen, simply the creation of databases and registries that allow the identification of individuals, that allow at some point for data to be appended to a unique ID. The second element of the social credit system that we've seen is one that has been getting a lot of very interesting press, and that is the idea of a blacklist system. What do we mean with a blacklist system? It's very simple. There's no data or no technology involved. This is not, this is not AI-driven, deep learning, algorithmic decision-making. It's very simple. You're on a blacklist or you're off a blacklist. If you're off the blacklist, fine, have a nice day. If you're on a blacklist, we need to talk. And there is not one blacklist, there are hundreds. Every major policy area has its own blacklist. So there's a blacklist for civil aviation, for people who misbehave on planes. There is a blacklist for production safety, for companies that play fast and loose with workplace safety regulations. Some of them belong to one ministry, but most of them are topical blacklists run together by a couple of ministries. The biggest one and the most, the most irritating one, if you have the misfortune of being on it, is the blacklist of the Supreme People's Court. And that is the blacklist for, literally translated, untrustworthy people subject to enforcement. What do we mean by that? if you break a law or regulation, and there's a document, a very long document, that spells out exactly which infractions fall under this system. But if you break one of the rules mentioned in that document, and you are convicted for it, and you refuse to carry out your conviction, you don't pay your fine, you don't carry out your injunction, you don't pay back your debt or your loan, then you get on that list. And then all kinds of things happen. All kinds of doors close. You can't become a corporate director anymore. You can't participate in government procurement programs, tendering and bidding processes anymore. You can't fly in aircraft anymore. You can't travel first class on trains anymore. You can't spend money, in fact, on luxury products in T-Mall anymore. This is a public-private partnership. You can't stay in luxury hotels anymore. The idea being that if you don't have the money to pay back your fines or your debts, then certainly you shouldn't be spending it on luxury watches and Ponzi hotels either. And so this is essentially what the social credit system in China looks like at the moment. An ecosystem of lists maintained by ministries and groups thereof at the national level, and maintained by city governments at the local level. And the city lists are really the fun ones, because you sort of notice that they've been drafted by civil servants who really were thinking only about their problem and not quite about PR. So there are a couple of cities where that have facial recognition cameras, and if you walk through the red light too many times, then you also get put on the blacklist. And that's the sort of thing that Western media love writing about. But in essence, that is, from the governmental perspective, what the social credit system looks like today. This may change in the future. It very likely will change in the future. But note that there is a word that I have not yet mentioned. And that word is score. At the moment, at the national government level, there is no scoring involved. At the local level, there are some cities that are experimenting with some form of scoring where if you have too many black marks against you, you can't, for instance, get government subsidies. You can't become a civil servant. You can't become a party member. But at the national level, the idea of scoring is absent for the time being, at least within the government. Because there's a reason why we think about scoring. And that reason is Alibaba. That reason is a feature of Alibaba, more specifically Ant Financial, Alibaba's e-payment arm, which is called Sesame Credit. And Sesame Credit is something very interesting. Sesame Credit is a sort of weird mixture of a trust-building system with a loyalty scheme, a little bit like Air Miles. Where does it come from? Actually, remember at the beginning, I talked a little bit about this idea that there was a problem in terms of consumer finance. And this is very much what Alibaba found once they moved into the e-commerce business. Compare with Amazon. When Jeff Bezos started Amazon, if he wanted to process payments, it was relatively simple. All he needed to do was set up an agreement with Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Diners might still be around, and that was done. But because, as we just saw, a substantial proportion of the Chinese population was either unbanked or underbanked, Alibaba, if it wanted to run an e-commerce business, had to set up its own payment infrastructure. It had to invent all of the supporting infrastructure for it to be able to carry out its core business. And if you do that, then you also need to be in charge of assessing some kind of risk. And partially that risk is financial, Partially, that risk is trust-based, right? Because a significant part of Alibaba's model is not that they sell stuff to you, but that they facilitate, like eBay, you purchasing stuff from a third party. And they are the intermediary platform. And they, therefore, must be able to ensure trust between both sides. They need to be able to ensure to the seller that they will be getting paid, and to the buyer that the buyer will buy what he or she intends to buy. And this is really where Sesame Credit comes from. And in the absence of reliable credit histories, reliable financial histories, because in essence, you know, the financial history for most Chinese people was an old shoebox under the bed, what do? You have to sort of dig around for some proxies. And we don't quite know how the Alibaba algorithm works. It's proprietary, that's a business secret. They say it's protected by intellectual property law. And they haven't quite helped themselves by making some controversial statements earlier on. My favorite one being a senior Alibaba corporate officer saying that people who bought nappies get a higher score than people who buy computer games, because if you buy nappies, then you're a mum or a dad, or you're a responsible person. If you buy computer games, then you're clearly not. So the yin and yang shopping trolley here is a big box of Pampers and Dungeon Keeper 4. But the fun thing is that, or at least not if you're Alibaba, the interesting thing is that this sort of thing very quickly severely harmed the image of Sesame Credit, because suddenly it was about paternalism. Suddenly it was about behavioral control, right? When it comes to China, Western audiences don't need a lot to get triggered in terms of this is a dictatorial government that is willing to do everything to deeply invade the lives of its citizens. And it harmed Alibaba's reputation actually a fair bit to this day. What they say their score is based on is a number of factors. One of them is very simply, how much do you spend on Alibaba? Right? The more you spend, the higher your score. Another one is, do you pay on time? Right? Do you obey the rules? Are you a good customer or are you a good vendor? If you pay your gas and electricity bills through Alibaba, do you pay them on time? But also, how complete is your information, right? If you fill out more information, if you have a verifiable user identity, you get a higher score. And lastly, your friends. And this was another one of these very controversial issues, because people are very rapidly triggered to say, if your friends are dissidents, you might have a problem. Well, yes, if your friends really are dissidents, then your problem is going to be a bit bigger than not being able to buy stuff from Tmall. But there was this idea that Alibaba was scoring you on the basis of what your friends did. Alibaba has denied this. Until we get our hands on the algorithms, there's no objective way of verifying or denying any of this. But the point is, from Alibaba's perspective, think about this. One of the big problems in the online space is very simply anonymity. When we behave differently, when we know that we can be identified, than if we don't. If tomorrow we took away all the license plates on all the cars, it would be carnage on the A2, I promise you. And so the idea is that what Alibaba is saying is that it does not base its the proportion of the score on what your friends do, but simply on the basis of the fact that you have a large network. Because the more verified friends you have, the less likely that it is that you yourself are a bot, some sort of swindler who is setting up a fake account in order to cheat and deceive. That's what they say. Now, this Sesame credit system can actually be a lot of fun if you have a high score, because Alibaba has, with a lot of its partners, negotiated a whole bunch of fun things. You can get easier access to a Schengen visa through the Embassy of Luxembourg in Beijing. You can, they have what they call a sort of deposit avoidance scheme, and there are hundreds of businesses, you know, from bike rental businesses to hotels to car renting businesses, the whole rigmarole, where if you have a high Sesame credit score, you don't need to pay a deposit when you're using these services. At the moment, it doesn't seem the case that there is a sanction in case that you have a low Sesame credit score, apart from, you know, not getting access to the benefits. The question is, however, in what way are they connected to the government? And we know they are connected in one way. Alibaba is part of some of the blacklist systems. If you're on the Supreme Court blacklist, you can't buy luxury products on Alibaba platforms. What we don't know is how they share data. And here, it is very often, very rapidly assumed that there is a very close and intimate connection between the Chinese government and these businesses, to the extent that the Chinese government has access to all of these businesses' data all the time. That's a very difficult claim to make. And until we as researchers get vastly upgraded research funding and capabilities, we won't quite know exactly how this works. But it is interesting to know that Sesame Credit was actually one of 8 pilot projects that was invited by the People's Bank of China, because the People's Bank of China wanted private businesses to set up mechanisms to give people portable credit scores in the way that Americans have their FICO score. So you have a credit score, and you can go to any bank or financial services provider and get loans or access to finance on the basis of that. With this story that I've just told you, you're probably thinking, there's possibly a conflict of interest here. And you'd be right, and that's exactly what the Chinese People's Bank thought. So none of these 8 businesses, including Sesame Credit, actually got a license to use the scores that they generated as portable credit scores. It's fine for Sesame Credit to operate within the platform, but you can't use it to get access to capital from another bank. The Chinese solution that was found was that these 8 companies together set up a joint company together with an institution overseen by the People's Bank of China, and that new financial credit scoring firm can issue these portable credit scores. So everyone gets a bit of what they wanted. But that is just an illustration to say that from the outside, we tend to look at the Chinese government as sort of this one coherent, supermassive black hole. The government does this, the government does that. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, and we need to do a lot more research. But until we do, we can't simply assume that the caricatural version of that is true. And that brings me to the point that I want to conclude with, and that is, what does the social credit system, what does our fascination with the social credit system actually say about us? I'm increasingly convinced that we live in a time that makes people scared, right? I grew up in the 90s, the Cold War was over, we thought we had discovered the recipe, liberal democracy plus free market capitalism, the West was on top, it would be the new American century. In Europe, we are friends with the Americans, so that will be fine. Good, we're 18 years into the new American century, and look what happened. We are in a world that is now scary, officially, right? We never expected that China would be so big. We never expected that the world would be as conflictuous as it is. And technology, the thing that was the symbol of this idea of progress in the 1990s, technology will make us wealthy, it will make us free, it will turn the world into a village, in fact turns out to be a big part of that threat. With the hacking of the American election, with all of these, public debates about data that we now have, with the Snowden and NSA surveillance regulation, suddenly we're scared. And we are scared of things like China, a country that, according to what we think about politics, should not exist, right? How's this place still around with its mixture of political closedness and economic openness. How can this be successful even though we thought that could never be true? For us, that's a very difficult thing to accept. It's an equally difficult thing to accept that this thing, technology, that we were so positive about just a couple of years ago, turns out to be quite threatening. And then when you bring together technology and China into one story, that's bound to be an absolute smasher. So very often the way that we talk about the social credit system, the way that we talk about China and technology actually doesn't say a lot about China. It says an enormous amount about us, about our hopes and fears, our expectations, our concerns. And so as important as the question is what can we do about China or how do we deal with China is, the first answer must always be we must ensure that our societies are strong, inclusive, open, and functioning well. That, I believe, is the best way forward. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.